All right, so good morning, everyone. This session is about Bootstrap. I titled it Creating Beautiful Websites Easily Using Bootstrap because that's exactly what it's about. Being able to create really nice looking websites without necessarily having to do a ton of work. Obviously, you're going to have to still, create the website, but Bootstrap makes it pretty easy. Now, I do expect that you have at least a little bit of knowledge um, about HTML. I'm not gonna. This is not this is not a creating websites from scratch session. This is, I assume, you have already been building websites using HTML, and this talks about Bootstrap specifically. Oops. All right, just to introduce me, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Doug Hennig. I'm a partner with Stonefield Software. Um, I'm the author of Stonefield Database Toolkit and Stonefield Query, which you may have heard of. I've also written a number of tools that come with Visual Fox Pro as a contractor for Microsoft, the Member Data Editor, the Anchor Editor, things like that. I also wrote a couple of tools that are in Sedna, My, and the Upsizing Wizard. I've written a lot of articles over the years in various magazines. I also have written a number of books over the years, the latest one being VFPX Open Source Treasure, available from the German Fox Pro user group. I am one of the co-organizers of Southwest Fox, also the webmaster. I'm a co-administrator of VFPX. I was a Microsoft MVP for 15 years. And in 2006, I was given the Fox Pro Lifetime Achievement Award. So as you probably know, web development is becoming more and more complex all the time. Back in the good old days of 5 or 6 years ago, we had to worry about different browsers. So Internet Explorer, different versions of Internet Explorer, or Firefox, or Chrome, or Mozilla, or things like that. These days, it's even more complex. Not only do we have to deal with those things, we also have to deal with different form factors. You've got smartphones, you've got small tablets, you've got larger tablets, laptops, desktops, and so on. So it just, that's another thing you have to worry about, are those different size factors. There are ways to get around those things. Web frameworks make it a lot easier. And if you come to Southwest Fox this October, Rick Borup has a session on being able to do this kind of stuff without using any framework at all, using the newest versions of HTML. But we're going to talk about one particular framework today called Bootstrap. It was originally created at Twitter for their own internal use, but it was released as open source in 2011. Earlier this year, version 4 was released. It's a complete rewrite of Bootstrap. And that's the one we're going to be focusing on. So don't worry about it. If you know earlier versions, you'll see some things that are different. If you've never seen Bootstrap before, that's completely fine. We're going to assume that you've never seen it before here. So some of the benefits of using Bootstrap are that, first of all, it's really easy to get started. There is really not much work involved. You don't really have to. You don't have to download anything if you don't want to. You can, but you don't necessarily have to. The grid makes it really easy to place objects. Show of hands, how many people here use tables to lay out stuff? Okay, that was a little joke. I can't see any of you, so there are no show. But if you back in the old days, you have, or even yesterday, if you haven't used Bootstrap or some other grid framework, you had to lay things out typically using tables or using floats, which were not very easy to get things just exactly right. Whereas with grids, it's super easy to make things laid out the way you want them to be. It allows you to create responsive, mobile-ready websites. And by responsive, I mean a website that can adapt itself for different form factors. So it can look good on a smartphone or on a desktop, which are completely different form sizes. And so that's one of the design features of Bootstrap, is being able to be mobile-ready. It automatically handles browser differences, so you don't have to typically worry about whether the user is using Firefox or Chrome or Internet Explorer. It provides base styling for most HTML elements that look a little bit nicer than the base styling that most browsers use. And it has a bunch of pre-built gadgets just beyond the regular things like buttons and text boxes and things like that. It has things like accordions and cards and things that we'll take a look at. There are just a couple of disadvantages. One is that it adds about 291K to every web page, although we'll see that there is a way around that. Oh, while we're here, Mike asked, can you make me the presenter? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Anyway, so one other thing. What's that?
I think that was an automatic message it was generating here when I was clicking around.
So
ignore that.
I got you. Okay. The other disadvantage is that this doesn't have to be the case, but often is the case, is that the websites kind of tend to look similar that use Bootstrap. So if you've seen websites where they've got a menu across the top, sort of a really jumbo size image, and then stuff that sort of appears nicely in scrolls and so on, that's sort of the look that a lot of websites have these days. That's likely they're using Bootstrap, and so they kind of tend to have a similar look, and that's not necessarily a great thing, but it's not a requirement either. It's just that people tend to work that way. So, all right, so let's talk about getting started. There's a couple of choices. One is you can use a CDN, or a content delivery network, which means there's absolutely nothing to download at all. So you can get started creating a Bootstrap website without installing a single thing on your machine. However, some people like to work with a local copy, and so in that case, you're going to download Bootstrap from the Bootstrap site. Let's just go and take a peek at that. So you're going to go to getbootstrap.com, and then you click on download. And then the one you'll probably want is the compiled CSS and JS. So those are minified files, and so they take up the least amount of space. So you just click on the download button and go get it. By the way, the Get Bootstrap site is really good. It's got tons of documentation and examples. You can download various themes if you don't want just sort of the stock built-in colors, for example, things like that. Now, Bootstrap has a dependency on jQuery, so you have to go and download jQuery as well. So let's go and check that out. So you go to jQuery.com/download, and the one you'll probably want here is the first one in the list, the compressed production latest version of jQuery. Again, they're minified files, so they take up the least amount of space. Some components that you may use in Bootstrap require another JavaScript a library called Popper. Not all of them do, so you don't necessarily have to have it. But if you're going to be using some of the components that use Popper, then you'll need that as well. So again, if we'll go to popper.js.org, and there's a download. Taking its sweet time starting up here. But anyway, there's a download option in here where you can so install right here. You'll click on that to go download that. What you'll end up with, let me just show you the folder on my machine. What you'll end up with is a bunch of zip files that you'll unzip, and the directory structure kind of looks like this. In the Bootstrap folder, there are two subdirectories, CSS, and so there's these minified files here, and also a JS folder, and there's some minified files in here as well. I've actually also put in the jQuery and the Popper files in here too. They didn't come that way, just that after I unzip those files, I copied those into the same folder as the Bootstrap folder. That way I have all my JavaScript files in one place rather than having them kind of spread out a bit. So, but you're welcome to put them wherever you want to. You just have to specify the correct paths, obviously, in your HTML. Now, if you're using Visual Studio, I'm going to be using Notepad++ for looking at our examples. But if you're using something like Visual Studio, you can use the NuGet Package Manager to go and pull these files down. So you don't have to necessarily go to these different websites to download them. All right, so now the next step is after you've either made the decision to use a CDN, which means you don't have to download anything, or you've downloaded these libraries. Let's assume that you have an existing HTML page that you want to update to Bootstrap. There's really only a few things you have to do with it. One is you have to make sure that it's using HTML5 because Bootstrap requires that, and so you have to just make sure that you have this doc type HTML in the header of the HTML file. You may already have that, but if you don't, you'll have to make sure that you have that. There's a few meta tags we'll look at in a minute. You have to specify the Bootstrap CSS. so that it knows about the various styling. And then in the bottom of your HTML, some people put it in the top, but it's better to put your JavaScript calls at the bottom because it makes loading faster. But you're going to load the Bootstrap, jQuery, and Popper JavaScript, either again from local files or from a CDN. So let's go and take a look at a sample web page. Here's about as simple a page as you can get, the typical hello world. So we have our HTML tag, we've got our head with a title, we've got our body with hello world. If we run this, we just get a page with hello world on it, nothing fancy. Now we want to bootstrapify this HTML page. So let's go and take a look at this example here. So a few changes. One is, as I mentioned here, I had just HTML as the opening tag here. Here we are going to specify the doc type HTML just so that we are we're using HTML5. It's not required, but I added to the HTML tag a language tag saying that this is in English. Again, not required by Bootstrap, but it's a recommendation that they make that you use that. Then I added these 3 meta tags here that weren't in the original file. This one specifies that if there's any encoding, it's going to be UTF-8. You could use something different, but that's the one that's that I'm using here. This one specifies that we want to make sure that we are, if the user is using Internet Explorer, that it's compatible with the latest version. And the next one just makes sure that our viewport, that basically everything is going to fit within the full page of the browser window. So those, as this comment makes here, those have to come first in the header. This we had before, although I did change the title, obviously. And then we're going to add the Bootstrap style sheet. So we're going to specify here that we want it to use it. And I'm pulling this off of the local my local drive, so it's going to come from the Bootstrap CSS bootstrap.min.css file here. Then we have the rest of this is the same, or this part is the same, and then we specify our JavaScript files, and they have to be in this order: jQuery, then Popper, then Bootstrap. Bootstrap has to come last because it has a dependency upon jQuery, so jQuery has to be loaded before Bootstrap does. As I said, Popper isn't required for everything. You might want to put it in there anyway, just because if you modify your page at some point down the road to use one of the pop-up features, then you'll want to have that there. So let's run this. And it doesn't look a lot different. It looks a little bit different, right? You notice that there's a different font and different size involved here. That's because, as I mentioned earlier, Bootstrap does some basic styling of, excuse me, HTML elements, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now let's look at the CDN example. This one is using local files. This one is going to use the CDN. So this one is exactly the same as the other one, except for the URLs specified for the CSS and for the JavaScript. So here, rather than specifying my local folder, here we're going to specify the CDN. Where did I get this address from? It's in the Bootstrap website. It tells you exactly what URL to use to pull this CSS, the entire line, because there's also this integrity tag here to make sure that everything is loaded properly with proper security and so on. So you just go and grab this right off the Bootstrap site and paste it in, and then you've got that. Same thing for these. I just grabbed these off the appropriate websites and pasted them in. So it tells me which version, where to go and grab jQuery from, where to go and grab Popper from, where to go and grab Bootstrap from. If we run this one, it looks exactly the same as the second one. It took a couple of seconds, you notice? Oh, well, maybe about a second or so to load, longer than the other one did. And that's because it had to go and pull these files from the internet rather than from my local machine. However, a benefit for using a CDN is that, remember I mentioned earlier that using Bootstrap adds, the size of those files. So if we take a look at that Bootstrap folder again, you can see that these files take up certain amount of space, and the CSS file takes up 142K for that one there, and 48K for this one here, and then another 85K and so on. So those have to be loaded from your site for every page. However, if you pull it from a CDN, well, of course, it wouldn't necessarily load it from every page on your site, but let's say that, for example, somebody goes to another site first, and they go to your site, then they go to some other site, and so on. It may have to download those files every time. Because it doesn't necessarily know that whether they're the same or not. So if you use a CDN where you're specifying this full version information, then the first time you hit that site, it will check its cache to see if it has those files. If not, it will download them. But the next time it hits them, it'll see that it already has them, and so it doesn't bother downloading them. So you actually get a couple benefits. One, like I said, is that if the user hits other pages or other sites that use the same versions of Bootstrap and jQuery, then the browser doesn't download them after the first time. And number two, it's using somebody else's bandwidth rather than yours, right? I mean, it's pulling off of these CDN sites, which have got huge pipes, maybe much more than yours does. Plus, not only bandwidth, but also the bytes per month kind of thing.
Hey, Doug, which would you recommend?
I don't think it really matters. On our website, we use the local files, but like I said, I don't think it really. I mean, if I had a site that was getting hit a lot more than ours does, then I would probably use a CDN, but we don't. So.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, now let's talk about Bootstrap's grid system, because this is kind of one of the main reasons why people start using Bootstrap in the first place, because it makes it really easy to lay things out horizontally, especially. So Bootstrap's grid consists of 5 columns. We're going to use the word column in a couple different ways here. So the first use of the word column means that you can think of the page as having 12 individual columns. Now, we're not going to use all 12 sort of at once. Like we're not going to have 12 separate things across the page. Typically, we're going to combine them together into columns, which is the second use of our example. And they have to add up to groups of 12. So for example, we might have one column that's 4 columns wide, another column that's 4 columns wide, another column that's 4 columns wide. So we've got 4, 4, and 4 adds up to 12. Or you could have 8 and 4, or 6 and 6, or 3, 9, and 3, or whatever. Or see, not 3, 9, and 3, 3 and 9. So any combination that adds up to 12 is what you're looking for. Now the other concept is sizes. So there are 5 different sizes in Bootstrap 4 that sort of tie to form factors. So XS is extra small. That would be essentially anything less than 576 pixels, which would basically be a smartphone. You've got SM, or small. That would be, say, a smallish tablet, or if your browser window on a desktop or a laptop was just size that small. MD is medium. That's sort of the next group. That might be, say, a larger tablet. LG might be, say, on a laptop. XL might be, for example, on a higher resolution laptop, or one with a bigger screen, or say a desktop, something like that. So you have 5 different sizes. Each of them scales up, though. So for example, if I specify MD, and we'll see where these get used in a minute, but if I specify MD, it really means MD and bigger. If I specify SM, it means SM and bigger. Now, the way that you use the grid is that you will start by specifying a div with class equals container or container dash fluid. The difference between the two is that container fluid is full size. So it goes right from the edge of your browser to both edges of your browser across the page. If you use container instead, rather than container dash fluid, then it gives you sort of a bit of margin on both the left and the right. It's basically a fixed size. So 750, 970, 1170, depending on what form factor they're in. And we'll see this in a minute as I resize my browser window. We'll see that the page will sort of jump in integral steps. So you start with a container. Then inside the container, you'll have another div, which is a class row for groups of columns or rows. And then finally, you'll use, when you actually want the individual cell inside a row, you'll say div class call dash something dash something. The first thing after the thing after the first dash is your size. So this would be your XS, SM, MD, LG, XL, and so on. That means that at that particular browser width, you're going to be using this many columns. The next number is the number of columns that you want. So if you want something that's 4 columns wide or 6 columns wide, and so on. So let's go and take a look at an example. So this page starts out exactly the same as the other one. So we have our 3 meta tags, we've got our doc type, we have our 3 meta tags, we've got our Bootstrap CSS. This one actually uses a custom CSS just for some styles. So we specify a second style sheet here that I created specifically for this. And so then here we go with our container. Within the container, we've got our row. You can have other things beside rows. Like here, I've got a heading, for example. But then we've got, when I want to start laying out things horizontally, I put in a row. And then within the row, I've got different columns or cells, really. So here I'm specifying MD, medium 4. So I've got 4, 4, and 4. This means I've got 3 equal-sized columns that are for medium and higher devices. And we'll see how that comes into play in a moment. Here we're going to have 3 unequal columns. So I'm going to have one that's 3 columns wide, one that's 6 columns wide, one that's 3 columns wide. So basically 1/4, 1/2, 1/4. Here's one that has just 2 unequal columns, so an 8 and 4. So basically, 75% or 75%, 25%, that kind of thing. So let's go and run this. And so here is my grid. Now you'll notice that we have this heading here is sort of outdented, right? It comes at the left edge, whereas this is indented a bit. That's because of my container. If we go back and look at the HTML, you see that my H3 here is not inside the container, but here now I do have a container and everything is within that. And so that's what, where'd my browser go? So that's what this gives me. So with a container, you get this automatic indentation on both sides. It's fixed to a particular size, and we'll see in a minute when I resize my window how that looks. So first of all, we have 3 equal columns. This one is 4 columns wide. This one's 4 columns wide. This one's 4 columns wide. Here we have 3, 6, and 3. Here we have 8 and 4. Excuse me. Now watch what happens when I resize my browser window. I'm going to make it smaller. And we notice that at some point it automatically jumps, right? As I go from here to here. So that sort of is a hint that we've moved to the next size grouping. Let's keep on resizing it smaller. So we're still above medium. And how do I know that? Well, you'll see in a second how I know that. So we're still above medium. Now we're not. Now we are actually below the medium size. This is the medium size. Now we are below the medium size. And you notice what happens. As soon as you get below the size you've specified, Bootstrap automatically switches from a horizontal to a vertical layout. Why? Because on small form factors devices, you really don't want to scroll horizontally. Nobody minds scrolling vertically. That's kind of expected on a web page, but people absolutely hate scrolling horizontally. Excuse me. I'm going to take a sip of water here. So as we get below the MD size, and because I specified MD here, that's the size at which anything below that size, it'll automatically switch to a vertical layout. As I get bigger, it switches back to the larger. And as I get bigger and bigger and bigger, it stays at that because remember, it scales up. So anything that's MD or larger will use this layout. Now let's go and change this from a container to a container-fluid, save that, and we'll just refresh the page here. And you'll notice the difference now. So container is a fixed size depending on the size of the browser window, whereas fluid is full size. So it goes right from edge of the browser to the edge of both sides of the browser. Oops, let's go back to here and just change that back again. And again, just refresh it. And so there's the difference between container and container fluid. You can combine classes, so you don't have to have just a single class. You can combine classes to get different column widths on different devices. So for example, this one says that if I'm on a small device, I want this to be 3 columns wide. If I am medium or larger, I want this to be 6 columns wide. You can also nest columns inside of columns. If you put a row div inside of a column div, now you've got cells within cells. I think somebody's, I'm just going to make sure that everybody's muted here again. Okay. So let's go and take a look at an example of those. So here again, I'm not even going to mention the header part anymore because they're going to be the same for every page except for maybe this, custom style sheet. I won't always be using that, but all the other lines are going to be pretty much the same for every page. And I won't talk about the footer anymore where we have our JavaScript because that's going to be the same for all of them. We'll just talk about the middle stuff. So here we're going to specify that on a small form factor, we're going to use 3 columns. On a medium and a higher, we're going to use 6, and then 9 and 6. So again, remember they have to add up to 12. So for small, it's 3 and 9. For medium, it's 6 and 6. That's inside of a container fluid. That's inside a row. Here we're going to show a nested column. So again, we've got a container. We have a row, and inside the row, we have an 8 column wide cell. Then inside that cell, we're going to have another row with 2 columns or 2 cells, 6 and 6. Then here is the second cell in the outside row. So this one was an 8, this is a 4, that adds up to 12. Inside this cell, we're going to have another row with 2 cells, 6 and 6. So let's run this. And here's the result. So here we have our 2 equal sized cells, but watch what happens as I make it smaller. As I get down to small, bingo, right there. Here I'm on the small form size. So now we have 3 and 9 rather than 6 and 6. Okay, so you may have a reason why on a small device you want different size cells than you do on a medium device or medium or larger. Here are the cells within the cell. So cell 1 and cell 4 are, you might consider to be siblings, right? They're both in the same row, 8 and 4. Within cell 1 are cells 2 and 3, a whole other row. These are 6 and 6, so they're equal size cells within the row inside that cell. And remember, if you do have any questions, like I said, just type them in the chat area and I will be happy to answer them. So you can stop at any time if you have any questions. All right, now let's talk about the different elements and how they're affected by Bootstrap. We'll talk about, first of all, we'll talk about the native HTML elements, text, tables, buttons, images, form controls, and forms. But then we'll go on and talk about some Bootstrap specific elements, some goodies that come with Bootstrap that you can use to make your HTML pages look nicer or have better features. We'll talk about nav bars for menus, for example, list groups, cards, accordions, a jumbotron, and there are lots of other elements. These are the ones that we're going to talk about, but there are tons of others as well. So let's go and take a look at these. Let's start by talking about text. Let's go and run this first, because most of what I'm going to want to explain is here in the window anyway. So the first thing you'll see is that this is an H1 here. Bootstrap's default font size. So here, if we look at the HTML, this is just a paragraph, or P tag. So you can see that the default font size is 16 pixels. Obviously, you can change that using style sheets, but that's the default font size. If we take a look at headings, H1 is 36 pixels high, H2 is 30, H3 is 24, and so on. The secondary text is if you use text muted. So this is what these look like. So I've got an H1, but within the H1, there's this small, which makes the text a little smaller. And by using class text muted, that tells it that I want it to be a lighter gray rather than black. So it kind of looks, a little muted. So these are what the various heading sizes look like. There's also another class called display. There's display 1, 2, 3, and 4 that really, now these are H1s, but you'll notice that they're actually quite a bit larger. This is way larger than the normal H1. So by specifying that display 1 class, it makes it stand out even more. So here's display 1 through 4. Here is just a regular P, but here I'm going to use the class lead. And notice how this looks different than this first one here. It's larger, actually, than this one here down too. It's a little bit larger. The text sort of appears a little more muted. So that's what lead looks like. Bootstrap has some built-in colors. So you'll specify those using text-primary, text-secondary, text-success, and so on. The nice thing about this is that these keywords, primary, secondary, success, info, warning, danger, muted, light, dark, white, and so on, are all consistent. So we'll see in various places the use of primary, secondary, success, not just on the text, but also on BG and lots of other places. The nice thing about it is that the colors are all the same. So let's go back to our browser window here. So we'll see that primary is blue, secondary, it might be kind of hard to see on your projector or your screen, but primary is sort of a nice blue. This one is sort of I don't even know what color that is. This is green, this is a different blue, this is sort of a yellowish color, this is red, and so on. So, but the word primary means always use these colors. The word secondary always means that particular color. And you're not stuck with these colors. You can have different Bootstrap themes. On the Get Bootstrap site is a theme builder where you can go and tell it what colors you want for primary, secondary, for text. You can specify all kinds of different cool colors. If you've ever been to the Southwest Fox website, and we'll look at this in more detail later on, but you'll notice here that there's lots of purples because that's one of our primary colors. So lots of different places in here. Let's go to our news page, for example. There's purple. This is actually the primary color. So anywhere the word primary is used, it's using purple. The reason that it appears in purple rather than blue is because I customize the theme, and so I have a custom Bootstrap style sheet rather than the stock one. So anyway, let's go back to our text. I'm going to close some of these windows, by the way. We don't need all of these ones anymore. Let's go back to our text. So to specify different colors for your text, you just specify class, text, primary, text, secondary, and so on. You can also do the same thing for background colors. So here, we're specifying primary, secondary, and so on. So it's the background color, that's the background that's that color now, not the text color. Although you can also specify text colors. Like here, for example, I've also specified text white. So that way I have white text rather than black text on my blue background or my gray background or my green background, because it's easier to read white on color than it is black on color. And so you can use multiple classes to set both the background color and the text color if you want to. Some other elements. If you use the mark element, so here's what it looks like. If I just specify mark around some text, it appears, again, it's maybe a little bit hard to see, but it sort of has a light pinkish background color on the text. Here's the ABBR tag. So it automatically underlines a word, changes the mouse pointer to a question mark when you hover over it, and if you wait long enough, pops up a tooltip that gives you some kind of description. And here's what it looks like. So we're using the abbreviation tag, and the title is what will appear as the tooltip. Oops, go back to here. Here's what code looks like. So code, the text appears in red and sort of I'm not sure if it's consoleless or what font it is, a sort of a monospaced font. Here's a block quote. So if I specify the block quote element, then this is what the text looks like. Pre looks like this. So again, it is a monospaced font, but in just black text as opposed to code, which gives me red text. But there's also another one. If you say pre-space pre-scrollable, let's go back to that here. So here I said pre-scrollable, then that, here I said class. It's a pre element, but the class is pre-scrollable, then that gives me this appearance. So it's a pre area, but it's scrollable. So that way, obviously I can scroll the whole window, but this little area is a scrollable area within my window. Tables. So here's an unstyled table. Let's go and run this and show you what it looks like. So here's my unstyled table. So all I did was I just said it's a table. It has a head with a head section with these elements, and then it has a body section with these rows in it. And here's what it looks like. Okay. Now, if I want to bootstrapify it, I just really have to do one thing. Instead of using table, I say table class equals table. So just adding one thing to my table, and now I get this appearance. So it adds some basic styling. So notice the differences here. I get lines, horizontal dividers between my rows, and it increases the padding between the cells. So instead of everything being sort of smushed together here, taking up the minimum amount of space, here it automatically adds padding to make the table spread out. Here I've said, in addition to saying table, I also said table SM, so it's now a smaller table. So it basically cuts the padding in half. You notice that there's a lot less horizontal and vertical space between the cells. Here's table dash dark. Somebody's making some noise. Let's see if I got everybody muted here. Yeah, it looks like everybody's muted that I can mute. Okay, anyway, so this is table space table dash dark. So that one change makes the table look this way instead. You can also use t-head dash dark. Let's go and take a look at the HTML for that. Here's the one we just looked at, table dark. That's the only change made. This one now uses on the t-head. So this is, we're going back to just table, but we're going to use on the t-head class, we're going to say t-head dark. And so now we get this. So only the header is dark. And you notice it automatically switches the text to white text on a dark background. Or I could use t-head light. This is what t-head dark looks like. This is what t-head light looks like. So now we have a lighter heading. Again, back to dark, back to black text, but we get this lighter heading. If you want striped rows, that's easily done. We simply use the table dash, so always table, but then table dash striped. So here's table dash striped, where alternating rows are in a different background color. If we say table dash bordered, now we have borders around all the cells. Here we had horizontal lines. Now we have borders around every cell, including the header. Table dash hover is kind of cool. It gives you this hover effect. As you move your mouse over a particular row, it highlights the entire row. So again, it's just table space, table dash hover, only change that was made. You can also use contextual colors. So if we go back to the HTML here, there's my table hover. So here I just said on each row, I said class equals table dash active, table dash primary, table dash secondary. So that's the only change here, is just on each row, I'm specifying a class, and now I get these colors. So active, primary, secondary, success. You notice these are the same colors that we saw earlier. So primary is a sort of bluish color, secondary is a grayish, success is greenish, danger is so there's reddish, and so on. So same color scheme that the background and the text colors used earlier, which is nice. That means you have a consistent theme. And finally, you can combine things. So this is table space, table dash hover, table dash bordered, and then contextual colors on the rows. So we get table bordered, so we have borders around each cell. Table hover, so we get this hovering effect. And contextual colors, because on each TR, I specified the appropriate color. All right, buttons. So the way that you make an item into a button is by specifying the btn class, followed by something which indicates what the button should look like. Button default, button primary, and so on. Now the interesting thing is you can style anything to look like a button, not just a button. So here, for example, we're going to use an anchor tag or a link tag, right, as a button. Here we're going to use the button element with type button and submit. Here we're going to use an input element with type button and type submit. And these are all going to be default buttons. So simply by specifying class btn-default, let's go and run this. Here's what it looks like. So although this is a link, you'll notice, look at how the mouse pointer behaves. It's not over top of the link itself. It's in the area within the button, and I still get the hand. Right? Whereas if I had just a regular old anchor tag, I wouldn't get the hand icon until I'm actually right over the link itself. So this is kind of a button. I can click here. I'm not on the link. I can click here and I still get the button. And you notice that when I hold my mouse down, I get this shape around it. So it still sort of appears like a link, but it has a button behavior. These ones are buttons. So really, it doesn't matter whether you use button or whether you use input, type button or type submit. Either way, when they're styled with BTN, they look like a button. Next, we have different styling. So here, let's take a look at the HTML. So here, I'm just going to use button for all of them, but the difference is going to be BTN default, BTN primary, BTN secondary, and so we get different colors for our buttons. Again, same color schemes we saw before. Here's our link, which is a different type. It's not an actual link here. It's specified as BTN link. So it's not an anchor tag. It's still a button, but it's using the BTN link. So it looks like a link, but again, it's sort of like this one here, although it has an underline effect as well. This one is light. It might be a little bit hard to see, but when my mouse is not over it, it has a very light blue background. And when I move my mouse over it, it becomes a little bit darker. Here is a dark button. If we look at the HTML for it, it's so BTN-dark. And here's one that's disabled. So disabled equals disabled. Seems a bit redundant, but this is a disabled button. So as I move my mouse over it, I don't get the hand pointer, and clicking on it does nothing. You can do outline buttons. So here, this is the same, except it's now BTN-outline-something. Default, primary, secondary, and so on. And so now it looks like an outline button, but it appears solid when I move my mouse over it. This one is, you notice it's really hard to see. It's so light that you probably can't see it at all. I can barely see it. It appears when you move your mouse over it. So probably wouldn't want to use that one a lot, but then dark looks like that. You can specify different sizes for your buttons. So here we can say BTN large. Nothing means the default size, obviously, and BTN SM would be a small button. And so here's what they look like: large, default, that's the default size, pretty much the same as all these, and then smaller button. This is a block button. That one was done by saying BTN block. I put it within a container because you notice how it has our edges on both sides, right? Our margins on both sides. That's because we're within a container, not container-fluid. Obviously, I wouldn't normally want a button this big, so probably what I would do with a block button is I would put it inside a cell. I'd create a row, I'd create a column, and then I'd put the button inside that, and that would control the size. So basically, a block button takes up the entire container it lives inside of. We can do button groups. Let's take a look at how this was done first. So here we're going to specify a div with BTN group as the class. Then we just put regular buttons inside that. But because they're inside a button group, they actually have a different appearance. You'll notice that the outer button has rounded edges, but the inner button has square edges. So rounded edges on the outside, square edges on the inside, and there's no spacing between them. So they appear as this group of buttons. You can also do it vertically instead of horizontally by just saying button group vertical instead of just button group. Then inside that, you just have ordinary buttons, and they get displayed because of the div. You can also do split buttons, which are kind of cool. So we want this kind of effect here, where we have a button, but when I click, I get a drop-down menu that appears. So that's pretty easily done as well. So here again, we're going to have a button group, a little bit more complex this time because we have more choices. But so we have our div, which is a button group that gives us this grouped button appearance, and the two elements inside of it are going to be these two buttons. So the first button is just a straightforward button as we've seen before, primary. The second button is going to be a drop-down button, so it's a little bit more complicated in its definition. It's still a button, and it's still button primary, so it appears the same color, but it has a couple of other things. It has drop-down toggle, meaning it's going to have drop-down behavior, or using the class that gives it that. And it also has this drop-down toggle split, so that way it appears with that little drop-down arrow. Sorry, I'm just going to mute somebody who just joined us. And then finally, these area things aren't actually required. Those are for if you have disabled, people who are visually disabled, it can read out information to them. So those are not required, but nice to have. But this data toggle is also required. That tells that we want the drop-down behavior as well. So this gives us our second button. Now the menu, this is what defines the menu. So we have a div class, drop-down dash menu, and it has and the items inside of it are going to have drop down dash item or drop down dash divider. So here, these are going to be links because typically you're going to want to do something. So that way, when I choose from this drop down menu here, we'd want to jump to another page or have some behavior or have something occur. But here, of course, I'm just linking to basically itself, to nothing. So we're not going to have anything happen. But so that's why these are links, but they could be something else. But drop-down item is what styles them to make them look like this menu item. So I've got two items, then I've got a divider, and then I've got another item. This doesn't have to be a div. This could be an li, or it could be an a, or it could be anything else. It's the styling that's important. It's not the element, it's the styling that makes it into a divider within a menu. Okay, so that's how we do that. This split button. Images. So let's go and run this. Images just sort of appear as they normally would, but they can be styled a bit. So here, simply by specifying class equals rounded, we get these rounded edges on the outside of the image. If you want to have a completely rounded one, then you simply specify rounded dash circle, and that's all. And then now it appears with this as this ellipse or a rounded edge. By specifying img dash thumbnail, now we get something that it's maybe a little bit hard to see because it's kind of subtle, but we have the image with square edges, but on the outside of it is a border that sort of has more rounded, a very light border, but it has rounded edges as well. So the idea being this would be a visual indication that if I click on this, it's probably going to zoom up and show me something bigger. It doesn't do that. You don't get that behavior. You have to actually, write that, code for that yourself by, doing a link on this, for example. But it at least gives you the visual appearance. And the last one here is a fluid image. So if you say image dash fluid and say put it inside a container or a container fluid, then it automatically resizes based on your window size. So let me resize this window, and we'll see what happens to the image. Okay, see how it's resizing? It's becoming smaller or larger. The other ones aren't changing because they're at the size that they're supposed to be. But because I said this is a fluid image, that means I want it to automatically resize depending on either my browser size, as I resize it, or if I'm running on a small device, it should appear small, and if I'm on a big device, it should appear big. Next, we have form controls. So here are some unstyled controls. Let's run this first. So here are some unstyled controls. So I've got a text area, an input text box. I've got one that's a password, so it automatically puts in the password marks. And then I've got a text area 3 rows high. So here's what they look like unstyled. So they have a square box around them, and no padding at all, and they're laid out horizontally at a certain size. Now to style them, I only did one thing. I just basically copied and pasted this stuff, and I just added one thing: class equals form dash control. That's it. That's the only change I made, and now they appear like this. So now they're automatically taking up the width of their container. Obviously, this is pretty wide, so and that's because I've got it inside of a container. More than likely, I'd put them inside a cell. I'd have a row, I'd have a column, and so inside that cell, I would put these things, and that way they're automatically no larger than my cell. So I could say, call dash MD dash 6, for example, to make it automatically that wide. But they are styled with a lighter gray outer box rather than the darker gray square box and rounded corners, and they're laid out this way rather than horizontally because they're that size, and they automatically adjust their width, of course, to match the container. Checkboxes. These are unstyled checkboxes. So here I just said that these are input type label equals checkbox, and then so these are the unstyled ones. Then to style them, I really just put them inside a div with a class equals checkbox. And this last one is checkbox disabled. So now they appear not a lot different because even the unstyled ones are using sort of the basic Bootstrap styling. But now it's kind of hard to tell here, but this one really is sort of, sort of to the width of its container. And again, I probably would put it inside a cell if I want to control the width. And we've got a disabled one here as well. You can also specify inline. So if you say checkbox dash inline, then they are laid out, even though they are styled a little differently, they're laid out horizontally. Radio buttons. So here we're specifying input type equals radio, and unstyled looks like this. So they're, again, laid out with sort of no spacing between them, laid out horizontally, versus styled. And really the only difference here between the unstyled and styled is I put them inside a div with a class of radio. And so it styles them as radio buttons. Again, doesn't look maybe that different, but they are a little bit different. And same thing, we can inline them as well. So here we say radio dash inline instead of just radio. Here's a select control, so unstyled. So we have this select here with our options. And so again, a darker border, square corners, and kind of takes up the minimum amount of space. The styled one, the only difference here was that, again, I said class equals form dash control. That's the only difference between those two. And now we get something that, again, more padding inside, a lighter gray box around it, nice rounded corners, and it takes up the width of its container rather than the minimum amount of width. Finally, something else is kind of cool. I'm going to just make this a little smaller to kind of make it a little bit more obvious here, is you can do input groups. So you can combine things together. So let's take a look at this. So here I'm going to do a div with a class of input dash group. That means that these two things are going to be put together. And if we take a look at it, oops, where'd my browser go? Oh, I made it too small, that's right. So here, for example, we're going to have a text box followed by a label. So the idea here is that I'm going to put in some kind of email address without putting in the swfox.net. It's sort of assumed because of the label. It's a hint that it's assumed. So again, this is an input group in the div, and then I specified form control on the text box. That's what's giving me my normal styling. And then here, input group dash add-on for this span to make sure that it's part of that, so it's styled the same way the rest of the group should be. The next one is, the idea here is I want to indicate that you're supposed to put an integer dollar amount. Like it's going to be $3 because there's a dollar sign here and a 0.00 here. And again, so it's an input group add-on on both sides, and then the form control in the middle. And then something similar here where we've got a text box and a button. And so here we have, again, an input group. We have a text box, again, with form control. And then we have a button inside a span that has that input group and input group button instead of input group add-on. And then we have just a regular button, a button primary. Oh, I'll make this a little bigger again. All right, next, forms. So here we're going to have a form, and then we're going to do, again, we're going to do stylized things. So we're using the form group similar to what I had before. So let's go and run this. So here, for example, we have an email address, a password, a checkbox, and a file input to choose a file, and then a submit button. So this is these make up my form here. And so I've got a form group that combines the label and the control. And again, I'm using form control, so we get styled nicely. So a label and a text box, and another label and a text box, and a checkbox, and then a file button. Again, all within a form group, so that way I get the label and the button together. And then finally my submit button with just, it's styled as a button. So that's what gives us this form with these controls inside that form. And there's a submit button for that form. I can also lay them out inline. So if I want to do them horizontally rather than vertically, then the only difference here, I basically just copied and pasted one form to the next one. The only differences are I added this. I said it's class form-inline, so now it styles them this way. Now, obviously, it doesn't know about how to place them horizontally, so I probably would want to put in a row with some cells, and that way they automatically fill their cell, and that way I have more control over the spacing between them. But you can see that you can lay them out horizontally as well as vertically. And if I make this smaller, it's going to adjust them automatically. The next one doesn't look a lot different than the first one, horizontal layout versus vertical layout. The only difference, again, I just copied and pasted, and the only change I made was I said form-horizontal, but it does have a little bit different behavior. The way that the label splits, for example, is a little bit different. It's indented a little bit, whereas the other one was not, and so on. So not a lot of difference, but there's a little bit. And the last thing here is you can have hidden labels. So I'll scroll down to the bottom here. So here you notice I don't have labels. I've got an email text box and I've got a password text box, and you can tell by the text inside it. As soon as I start typing it, that hint disappears, but when it's empty, it shows the hint. So for most people, that would be good enough to know to type my email and my password here. However, for people that have vision problems, like my best friend, for example, we've been best friends for 40 years, and about 5 years into our friendship, he got a disease of the eye and lost his vision. So he's not totally blind. He has 20 and 200 vision, but he's legally blind. So he relies on devices that allow him to zoom up, make things bigger, but he also relies on a screen reader to read out text to him. So you can actually do your users a favor by adding a label here. For example, you notice this label didn't appear for us. Here's our text box, but this label didn't appear, and that's because its class is SR only, screen reader only. So it won't appear visually, but if the user has a screen reader turn on, it'll read out email address, the content of the label. And same thing for this one. It'll read out the word password, so they know that this control is for an email, for a password, because they probably can't see that placeholder. All right, let's talk about nav bars. So this is the simplest nav bar. Let's go and run this first. So here's my nav bar. It doesn't have any drop downs, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, but it's sort of the basic nav bar where I've just got something that looks like this, and I've got these buttons that would link me to somewhere else. Now, one behavior that you may not be expecting is that when I scroll, it disappears off the top. You may want that behavior or you may not. So we'll take a look at in a moment how we'll change that. But let's look at how this nav bar was defined. So we have this nav element, and it has a class of navbar expand LG. That's what sort of gives it this larger appearance, and navbar light BG, background light. So that's what gives it sort of this light appearance. We'll take a look at another example that's a dark appearance in a minute. So just going to use some different classes. So here's my nav. Inside the nav, I have a few elements. So I have this image and I have these items here. So here's my image. It uses a class of navbar-brand. It's not really required. If I take it out, we don't see maybe necessarily a lot of difference. But by following that convention, that means that it sort of behaves, that would be the branding image for the navbar. The next three things we actually don't see. You notice it just defining a button, and yet we don't really see a button here until I do this. Notice how it changed the menu into a hamburger button over at the right here. And when I click on it, it drops down and shows me the menu that we had before. When I make it large enough, that hamburger button disappears. This is what defines the hamburger button. So by saying it's just a button, but it has a class of navbar-toggler, which tells it that it has to use that hamburger button appearance. So it either appears or doesn't appear depending on the size. It's a type button. Now, what makes it So the navbar toggler is what gives it the appearance of appearing or not appearing, depending on the size. What gives it the drop-down behavior is this: data toggle equals collapse. That tells it that it's a collapsible item. So it can sometimes be collapsed and sometimes expanded. Its data target is navbar nav, right? With this hashtag in front of it that says find something that has an ID of navbar nav. That's what I'm supposed to drop down to. Okay, so that's how it knows that when you click it, it's supposed to display this particular menu because its data target is the ID that I've specified here. Area controls, again, areas is only required if you're dealing with disabled users. But this tells it basically the same thing, that it should read out, for example, items from this same navbar nav. And expanded false means it starts out collapsed. And its label would be toggle navigation. So when the screen reader reads it out, it would say toggle navigation. And then finally, this thing here, this span navbar toggler icon, is what gives it that appearance, right? So the 3 lines. If I took that out, we would have a button without the 3 lines. So we'll want to include that to make it look like a hamburger. Next, we have our menu item. So the ID is what links it to the button. The collapse, navbar collapse, tells it that it's a collapsible region and that it's tied to the navbar. And that means that, you know, we get this kind of appearance, or that if this navbar collapses for some reason, that it's tied to that navbar. Then inside of that, we have a div, which is a navbar nav, meaning that this is my navigation bar. And then inside that, I have just my items. So I've got and these are all just links. So home, forms, tables, text, and this one is going to be disabled because of the disabled. So it's a nav item. That's what tells it that it is an item within a nav bar. And nav link gives it the appearance and behavior of a link. Well, not obviously the behavior, but it gives it the appearance of a link. So that's our menu. So there's a bunch of stuff here. Like, this is the entire menu. So that's a bunch of stuff here, but you know, you really don't have to memorize all this. Really, how I created this menu was I went to the Bootstrap site, looked up the nav bar, copied the example, pasted it in here, and changed my text. So like I said, you really don't have to know all of the stuff involved in how that nav bar works. So this was the light one. Here is the dark one. So the only difference, this is basically copied and pasted. The only difference is I just changed these 2 things. And now it looks like this. So now we have navbar dark instead of navbar light. Oh, sorry. One other thing I wanted to show you here. As I mentioned, this allows to be scrolled off, which you probably don't want. You probably want it to be more like, well, that one doesn't scroll. So if you, oops, let me just, sorry, I just got to mute somebody else here. So if we want to make it so that it does not scroll like that, scroll off, we simply add fix-top as the style. And so if we go and refresh this page, now it no longer scrolls. Okay. If we take that back out again and refresh, now it scrolls again. Okay, so whichever behavior you want. Typically, if it's a menu, you don't want it to scroll, but again, it's under your control. Now, typically, you don't have a nav bar that's just a bunch of links. Typically, you want a drop-down menu. So you want something that looks more like this. So when you click this button, a menu pops down. This one doesn't, but you know, so some of them may be just a single link. Others, you want to have a pop down. So obviously, this one's going to be a little more complex. It starts off the same. So we still have our nav class. Excuse me. We have our image. We have our hamburger button. We have our navbar nav with collapse and navbar collapse. So pretty much everything up to this point is the same. Now, inside this, we're going to have our actual menu. And so here we're going to use a UL, so an unordered list. And then we're going to have LI elements inside that. So here is the first one. This is the home link, and this is another way of doing it. I could have done it similar to the way the last one does, but went. But typically, for your drop-down menus, you're going to use an LI. So here's the way we're going to do it. So we're going to specify it's going to be a nav item, just like all the other ones were in the other menu. And inside that, we're going to have a link, which is a nav link. I could have taken this out and just done nav link space or nav item dash nav space nav link. But because I'm putting this in a UL, I want to have a bunch of LIs inside of it. So again, it's the class that does the styling, not the element. So it doesn't matter whether it's an LI or an A, it's the class, it's the nav link, nav item that give it the appearance and behavior. So here's my first one. It's home. It's not a drop-down item. It's just a single item. Now the next one is going to be a drop-down item. So it's an LI. It's a nav item, but it's a drop-down item. So we're going to want to probably display, like an item. So here is what we're going to be specifying as the information. So it has the word information with this little down arrow. So it's a link class. It's a nav link. It's a drop-down toggle. We saw this before for our split button. So drop-down toggle means that it's a drop-down item that can drop down or collapse back up again. It's a drop-down, so data toggle is set to drop-down, and again, ARIA you can have or not have, and then the word information. So this actually appears with that little down arrow as well because of this drop-down toggle. That tells it to appear with a little down arrow beside it, and the behavior is controlled by this data toggle. So this is the item that appears. Now we have our drop-down menu, and here it is here. So again, we're just going to have a div drop-down menu. Again, same as we saw before with our split button. So a div with a drop-down menu is the class, and then drop-down items with drop-down dividers in between items and links. Now here, I'm not linking to anything. In a real menu, obviously I'd have an href that would take me to a particular page. So that way when I click on the item and choose news, it would take me to the news page, for example. So this is just a demo, so we don't have anything in here. But that's how the menu is defined. Again, I just copied and pasted from the Bootstrap website, changed the menu items, changed the links and so on. But the guts of this, all these classes to use and so on, I just copied and pasted. So really, really easy to do those menus. All right, list groups. So a list group, let's show you on the Southwest Fox site where you might, let's close some of these pages first here. Let's show you some examples of a list group. Let's go to the sponsors page. This is a list group. So here, although it doesn't look like it, this is a list group item and this is a list group item. So this whole row here, this row here, and this, they don't look anything alike. Didn't want to do that. They don't look anything alike, and yet they are the same thing. This is a list item, that's a list item, that's a list item, that's a list item. This diamond sponsors is a list item. Okay, so let's take a look at how we do those. So a list group, let's go and run this actually first. So here's the basic list group. The outer items, so there's a sort of a rounded light gray box around the entire thing. The inner things have square lines. Okay, so that way this sort of gives you the appearance of being a group. So here we're going to have a container. In this case, it's a UL, but it doesn't have to be. This could have been a div with a bunch of divs inside of it or spans inside of it or whatever. Here, again, it's not the element that's important. It's the class that does the styling. So here we're going to use a UL with a style of list group. That's the outer container. Inside of it, we have some list group items. So here are my 3 items. The next one shows some badges. So here, it's basically copied and pasted from the first one, except there are some badges here that indicate maybe a count of the number of items. If we take a look at the Southwest Fox site here, for example, and we take a look at here, the Who's Coming page, this was done as list items with badges here. So the number of people coming from each state, for example. So here's how this was done. Again, we have a UL of list group. We have LIs of list group items, same as we had before, but then there's a few more classes on it here. Here, this stuff here says that I want to, let's go back and show you. So here, I want these things to be left justified, but I want the labels here, or these badges, to be right justified with the proper amount of space in between them. So all of this stuff here tells Bootstrap to do that. To do the actual badge itself, I just specified a span. Badge dash primary, that specifies the color. Badge dash pill specifies the shape. So there are different shapes you can use. This one is sort of a pill shape. And then the text that goes inside that. So this is my next list group. Here's another list group. This one is good. I just decided for whatever reason to make it different. Rather than using ULs and LIs, here I'm using a div and anchor tags inside. So again, as I said before, it's not the elements you use, it's the classes that you use that do the styling. So here's what it looks like. Here's the first item that's defined as active, meaning it appears with a background color. Here's the second item that was not, so this one is they're all list group items. So this one has active, this one doesn't have anything, this one has disabled. And so active, not active, and this one is disabled. Oops. And if we go back to this list group here, the only difference between this list group item and this list group item, well, two differences. This one is active, meaning it shows the background color, and obviously this one has some content in it as well. But that's really the main difference. That's why this appears with the background color, is because I added the word, the class active to its item. And so it looks like a header, but it isn't really. It's really the same. It's a list group item just like these are, but it's active instead. You can also specify contextual colors. So let's go back to, oops, let's go back to, I keep on clicking the wrong spot. Let's go back to this page here. So here we've got primary, secondary, success, info, warning, the same color schemes we've seen before. And this just by adding, in addition to list group item, we just added list group item dash and then a color name. And then that way it appears with different colors in here as well. So that's the other way I could have done that heading, is rather than specifying it as active, I could have said list group item dash and then something that would be the color that I wanted to use. Cards are pretty cool. They're a way of sort of nicely putting stuff together. Let's take a look at a real world example first. Cards are used in a couple of places on the Southwest Box site. On the news page, these are cards. Okay, so it appears with this container with a header and text inside of it. It's also used on the testimonials page. Again, kind of look the same, but laid out this way. The nice thing about cards is that they automatically adapt their height to the content, but all the cards in a given row take up the sort of the height of the tallest one. So I didn't have to say, okay, well, the row has to be this many pixels high because this guy is that many pixels high. I just said, I want a row, I want 3 items in it. Here's the text, here's the text, here's the text, and it automatically adjusts everything automatically. So let's go and take a look at, let's go and run this. So here's how you define a card. You specify a div with a class of card, and then inside the card we'll have different elements. Here's one that only has a body. So it has another div with a class of card-body and then some text. And so it looks like this. It's just it kind of looks no different than that list group did, just with only a single list item, but that's the start of a card. Inside the card, we can have other things. So for example, here's again a card. Here's my card body, but inside the card body, I'm going to have something that has a tag on it or a class on it of card-title, and then I'm going to have my card-text. So this one goes a little bit further than just the basic card. It has a title, which appears in a certain way, and then here's my card text. Here's something with more stuff in it. Again, we just have a card body, but within that we have our card text. Here's a card subtitle. I want it to have text muted, so it appears sort of in a more muted color. And then I have my card text, and then I have a couple of links inside of that. These are just regular old A tags, but they have card-link as their class, and so that's what gives them this particular appearance inside of my card. Here's one that has an image cap on it. So it's basically the exact same one as the previous one, except inside the card, we have this image, just a regular old image, except its class is card-img-top, so that it has that particular behavior within that, or appearance within that card. Now, more likely is a card that has a header, possibly a footer as well, but at least a header. That's what these are. These are cards that have a header. So here's what the appearance looks like. A card header, my card body, here's my card footer. So here is inside my card, I have a card header. So that's what gives it that, here's what gives it that, that light gray background. The text itself is defined because it's an H3, but my background is defined because of that card header. Then I have my card body, same as the exact previous one, so I have to look at it. Then I have my card footer, and this is just a regular old P. So again, remember, it's not the element, it's the class. So this could have been a div, or it could have been a P, or it could have been an A, or it could have been anything. It's the class that says this is supposed to look like a footer, and so that's why we get this footer looking appearance here. Next, we can use contextual colors. So here, for example, here again I have, now these are going to be done as a card group, meaning that this is one card. If I had another card, I only show one card here, but if I had another card, there'd be some spacing between them. By specifying card group, now my cards are going to be put together touching. And again, you notice the entire thing has the rounded corners, but the inner ones have square corners. So that way they give you that appearance of being sort of one group. So I have a div of a card group. Inside the group, I have 3 or 4 cards. 1, 2, 3, and 4 cards. And I'm specifying text white and background primary, background secondary, background success. So that's why the entire card is this color, because I specify the color on the card itself. Then I have my card body, my card title, and my card text inside of it. So my card title and my card text. So these are card groups. Next, we have text color. Rather than having the background color, I just want the text color to change. So the only difference here is, again, it's a card group, and I have my 4 cards. But rather than saying background secondary, background primary, I just didn't use that. Instead, on the card, I said text primary, text secondary. So that way we don't get our background text. We just get our, and in fact, the other thing here is that it would show the colors here. Here, we're just having the text. Next, we have a card deck. So rather than a card group, the only difference here is rather than card-group, it's card-text. And so now we do get some spacing between them, in between those, but they're laid out sort of nicely without having to specify a div row and div columns. Because I said it's a card deck, it sort of automatically gives me that row and column behavior. But of course, as I resize it, if I get it small enough, it's going to switch to a horizontal layout rather than a vertical, or a vertical layout rather than a horizontal layout. All right, just a couple more things before we wind up. Accordions. Let's show you again a real world use of an accordion. Let's go to a previous year because, oh no, we can go to this one. Let's go to sessions. So this page has a lot of content. And if each of these things showed a session title and the text, we'd be scrolling forever. So by collapsing each session to just show the title, but have the behavior of clicking on it expands it so I can read it, clicking on it again collapses it, that's an accordion. So the idea is I want to have these expandable areas with text, but I don't see it unless I want to. And you'll notice that I can either expand and collapse by clicking on the same one, or if I click on a different one, then it collapses the other one and expands this one. So that's what an accordion is. Let's go and run this simpler example, which is basically the same thing. And so you notice I can either click on them to expand them this way, or by doing it individually like this. So here's how you define an accordion. It's actually pretty straightforward. So we have a div, classes, and accordion, and inside the accordions, we just have cards. So these are actually cards. So this is the card header, this is the card body, okay? But how does it have that accordion behavior? Well, that's because of a couple of things. So it's just a, here's my card header, and here's my card body down here, right? Here's my card body. But here's what gives it that collapsing behavior. So inside of this, I use data toggle collapse, right? We've seen this before. That's what gives it that collapsing behavior. And the other thing is I specify data target, and I point to something that has an ID of this, which happens to be this div here, which happens to be my card body, right? So my card header appears, only my card header appears. When I click on it, it expands and shows my card body. So this is the entire card right here. So here's my card header. Because of the data toggle collapse, means it's going to be a collapsible item. Because of my data dash target, it knows that this is the thing that gets expanded or collapsed because this div has an ID. And by default, this one, when I first opened this page, the first item was automatically expanded because of the show class. This one doesn't have a show class, so these ones weren't expanded. And then inside of that, I also have data parent is my accordion. So that way that ties back to this guy here. This didn't have to be, the fact that this has an ID of an accordion, gives it the accordion. Well, it's not that gives it the accordion behavior. I could change this to XXX and it would still work. It's the fact that these are collapsible items. But this is the data parent, meaning that when I click on this item here, how does it know what other card to collapse? Well, it does because it looks at the parent, which it is named by the accordion. It goes back to this guy here on the name, or on the ID, I should say. Okay, so that's the accordion. So we've got a div with 3 cards inside of it. We have a card header, and inside that card header is a button that is defined as collapsible. And here's the text for that button. So even though it looks like a link, it's actually a button. And that's my card header. And my card body is this text here. And because its class is collapsed, it means it's collapsible, and its parent ties back to my overall div. Okay. So that's kind of whipping through it fairly quickly. But again, I pretty much copied and pasted the text from the Bootstrap website and then changed the text to my own content to get, to do this. So I didn't have to learn all these different classes and so on. I just, ripped it off the website. All right, one last thing. It's kind of a simple thing. You may have seen some websites where at the very top, maybe below a menu, for example, you've got some big image or big text area where everything inside of it is sort of bigger than normal. That's a jumbotron. And so you just specify a div or an anchor or whatever. In this case, we're going to use a div because there's going to be things inside of it. Its class is jumbotron. Other than that, there's nothing else inside here that's any different. But everything is made larger, even though this is an H1 that's bigger than H1 text. And this button is bigger than it would normally be. Even though it's a button large, it's still bigger than it normally be. And we get this sort of this gray background with the rounded edges. That's because it's a jumbotron. So that's kind of all there is to that. There are lots of other what am I trying to say here? There are lots of other little doodads or gadgets available from Bootstrap. If you go back to the Bootstrap website here, which is taking its time. Okay, if we go to documentation here, which again is taking its time, we'll see that there's lots of other things besides jumbotrons and accordions and cards and so on. There's lots of other components here. So there are badges we've already seen. There are breadcrumbs. We've already seen buttons. There's cards. There's carousels, which are sort of horizontally scrolling things. There are drop downs and navs and nav bars. There's popovers. These would require that one class we talked about earlier. There's tool tips and all kinds of different things in here. So lots of things available within Bootstrap. Let's take a look now, just one last thing before we wind up here. I want to show you a practical example of where I use Bootstrap. Let's go back to the Southwest Fox site and look at the 2013 page. So this was the 2013 site before I implemented Bootstrap. You'll notice that as I make my browser smaller, I don't get any responsive behavior. What does that mean? Yeah, I got to scroll horizontally, right? Which nobody likes doing. As a matter of fact, let's make this a little bigger. This is a screenshot from my phone. That is unreadable, right? Not only do I have to scroll horizontally to see all the content, I have to pinch and zoom, pinch to, to zoom the text up so I can read it, and then pinch it back down again to scroll, and pinch it back up again to read it, and pinch it back down to scroll. I'm sure you've all seen websites like that on your phone, right? Not only that, but this was tons of work to get this. You see how there's two columns here? Actually, there's three columns. Two columns of text here, one column of text here, images over to the right. I had to use a ton of CSS. I read an entire book on CSS just to be able to do that. As a matter of fact, it really felt like I was doing this when I was doing that. Right? I mean, every time I'd make a change in, let's just run that again. Oops. Every time I'd make a change in one place, it would screw up someplace else. I'd fix up that other place, it would screw up the first place. I'd change the first place, it would screw up the third place, right? So it felt like I was constantly fighting with the website to make it look the way it wanted. And like I said, it's completely mobile unfriendly. So starting in 2014, we implemented Bootstrap. This is a screenshot from my phone. That's very easily readable. There's no horizontal scrolling. Everything gets to a nice, as I make my site, let's go to the home page here. As I make my site narrower, say on a phone, everything switches to a vertical format. So I still get all the content, but now it's a vertical format. There's no, and we get this, we get this hamburger menu, right? As opposed to the menu being cut off like it was before and so on. So, like I said, we get, and the other great thing is that I got to rip out all of that custom CSS. There's a little bit of custom CSS now, but like maybe 3 classes out of the 50 or whatever I had before. Maintenance is super easy. There's hardly any tables now to lay out things horizontally. Maintenance is super easy. I mean, I literally use Notepad++ now, rather than Visual Studio or some other HTML editing tool, because I can just make a couple of quick changes and to add new news items, for example. I just copy and paste a card and then put in, change the heading, change the text, I'm done. So it really was, it took a bunch of work to implement Bootstrap, but now the maintenance is just so easy. So a few resources, getbootstrap.com is where you download Bootstrap. Tons of documentation is there. w3schools.com/bootstrap has got tons of tutorials and exercises, and you can actually try stuff out live. You can type some HTML and it'll show you over at the right exactly what that would look like, so you don't have to do it on your own. Syncfusion has some free ebooks, not unfortunately for Bootstrap even version 3, which is the old version now. I think it's version 1 and 2 only, but it's a start. And if you want a Bootstrap visual editor, just Google Bootstrap visual editor. There's tons of choices. I don't think I found any free ones, but most of them aren't necessarily that expensive. And so, that way you can have drag and drop rather than using Notepad+ for everything. Now, I do have a question here. Somebody asked, scroll back down here. How do you customize the colors? On the Bootstrap site, let's go back. Do I still have it open? Yeah. If you go to themes, there is a theme editor here where you can pick from all these different predefined themes. Some of them are free, some of them you have to pay for. If I show you the Stonefield site, for example, we actually used a paid for theme, but it was well worth it because it gave us, automatically gave us this carousel, automatically gave us, oops, let me make this a little bit wider here. Automatically gave us this sort of bouncing effect. On all these different things, it automatically gave us, some of these different links down here, like this footer appearing this way. So that we paid, I think, $30 for this theme, but it automatically gave us tons of stuff. So it was well worth the cost because I would have spent hours and hours and hours, building this visual appearance doing that. So with this themes page, you can buy or download some free themes, but there's also a theme builder where you can go in there and say, okay, I want primary to be purple, like I did with the Southwest Fox site. My primary color is purple. My secondary color is this. My warning color is that. My info color is this, and so on. So you can change all those colors using the theme builder, and then you click a button and it downloads to your machine a Bootstrap CSS file that you use rather than the stock one. So that's how you change all your colors. All right, so let's wind up. Bootstrap makes it not easy, but easier to create really attractive mobile-ready websites. You get, it's automatically mobile-ready. It's responsive. So as you change form factors, if somebody looks at your website on a phone versus on a desktop, it'll, you can tell it how the appearances should differ or not. It's automatically handles browser differences. You get all these gadgets. So if you want jumbotrons and accordions and cards and all the other things we've seen, they're all built into Bootstrap, nothing else to download and install. And it's really easy to get started. Like I said, if you use a CDN, you don't have to download anything at all. Or you can just download it takes 5 minutes to download Bootstrap and Popper and jQuery. You probably already have jQuery. And so to bootstrapify your website, obviously, is going to take a little bit of time, but it's really easy to get started. All right, so we'll stay here for a couple more minutes. If you have any questions, go ahead and I guess those of you at GraphUg can ask them because you're not muted. But anybody else, if you want to type something, I'll be willing to answer any questions you have.
I have 5 types.